Good. Well, it is 9:02 by my watch, or my clock, so we'll go ahead and dig into the Great Reset, Chapter 7, continuing our whirlwinds tour through the book of Acts. We're going to do a big chunk today of text, so we'll not be able to read too much of it, unfortunately. So I'll sort of summarize and read a couple passages, but we're starting at the end of chapter 21. So just by way of quick recap, we've talked about, this is the Great Reset. The event of Jesus Christ resets everything, just about everything, and there's some continuity with how God has acted in the world, and yet this is also something new, which is great. And so the book of Acts follows this first generation or two of Jesus followers, and tells how they're making sense of who Jesus was, and how they're bringing the good news in ever expanding circles out into the world. So we've talked about resetting vision. The statement of the book of Acts, the statement for the church: you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all of Judea and Samaria and to the very ends of the earth. And as we've traced the narrative, we've gotten pretty far. We haven't quite gotten to the ends of the earth yet, but we've definitely been in Jerusalem. We've been in Judea and Samaria and a little bit further afield. And
forecasters expect the storm to move north along the state's coast through tonight.
And we have a hurricane update, unfortunately. Yeah, that's fun. And then we talked about resetting community. So the Holy Spirit bringing community together around the apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking of the bread, and the prayers. And then some of the organizational structure that needs to happen when communities are growing. We talked about resetting success, and the role that persecution plays. These couple stories with Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, and Philip and Simon the magician, and the Holy Spirit and this sort of partial conversion. Resetting membership, that was a big topic. What do the Gentiles have to say about any and all of this? Resetting conflict. How do we, when conflict arises in the community, what are our sources of authority? What do we refer to? And how do we go through that? And how do we live in this sort of dialectical tension, where we don't just say, oh, it's all good, it's all fine, but how do we live together in self-sacrificial ways for the sake of unity? And then last week we talked about resetting evangelism. How do we bring the good news into the world? What's the what are the things to keep in mind? And Paul and Silas and their experience in Philippi with Lydia, and her leadership and her wonderful witness in the community, and then the jailer who was an unlikely convert, and singing hymns in the dungeon and all of that wonderful stuff. So today we are going to talk about resetting political engagement. So this is going to be fun. This is going to be very exciting. Talking about politics a little bit, not too much. And so by way of what the texts that we're going to be looking at, by and large, are going to be texts that we're looking at Paul, and when he returns from his missionary journeys and heads back to Jerusalem, and he gets arrested. And then the next 4 or 5 chapters of Acts are all about Paul and his presence before various authorities, all of whom are very powerful and sort of increasingly powerful secular authorities, and the witness that he is able to continue to give, and how he navigates this political system. And basically this question that they all have, all the secular authorities have, which is, well, what do we do with this guy? we can't quite figure this out. And so he kind of gets passed around for a couple of years before he ends up heading to Rome. But that's sort of where we're going. So if we turn to Acts chapter 21, what we'll do first is I'll just sort of do a real quick narrative overview, hitting the highlights, because it's chapter 21 through like 27, so we just simply don't have time to read all of that. But I commend it to you. It's good stuff. So Paul has been he's been away. He returns to Jerusalem. He meets with the gathered community there, with James and others, and they say, you've been doing all this wonderful work out with the Gentiles. You should go and go to the temple and complete some purification rituals. And Paul says, okay, kind of surprising, giving some of his other his commitment to things that we've talked about last week in terms of what the Gentiles' expectation is, but he is still an observant Jew, and so that would and a Christian, and so he goes to the temple, and just as he is about to complete the 7 days of ritual, some folks from Asia Minor show up in Jerusalem as well. And they remember Paul and remember that he was a bit of an agitator in their city. And they accuse him wrongly, but they accuse him of bringing a Gentile into the inner courts of the temple, which was a big, big no-no. You didn't really do that. That would get you in trouble. And so basically what happens is that starts a riot. And Paul is seized and is getting beat up by this mob, and what happens is that it's becoming a riot essentially. And so the Roman tribune, and so this is the head of the garrison, the head of the Roman Roman base essentially. So there would have been about 1,000 troops that this Roman tribune would have been in charge of, and he would have been charged with keeping the peace in Jerusalem, which was a pretty big task at that time. So he sees a riot starting, and he wades in with his soldiers, and they come to sort of the center of the riot where Paul is getting beat up, and they arrest Paul because they think, well, you're the agitator, so you must have done something wrong. And this Roman tribune's name we hear later is Claudius Lysias, and he features fairly prominently in this narrative for the next little bit. So they rescue / arrest Paul because it's sort of, he's in custody, but he also was going to be killed. So it's sort of protective custody at this point. And Paul asks for an opportunity to speak to the crowd. The tribune says, okay, that's fine. So then Paul speaks to the crowd in Hebrew, which kind of quiets them down. He tries to give, he tries to make a defense of himself. He says, I didn't do that. I didn't bring this guy into the temple. And then he gives his testimony, his road to Damascus story. He talks about how he encounters Jesus, how he encountered Jesus. And then he gives a little summary of his mission and life. And at verse 22 of chapter 22, so up to this point, they listened to him. So it seems like the Jewish community is sort of receptive, interest. Okay, this guy's preaching something. This all sounds good. But Paul ends his little sermonette by saying that Jesus told him to go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles, and that gets them riled back up. So the tribune at this point is like, well, what's going on? I need to get to the bottom of this. So what we're going to do, Paul, is we're going to tie you up and we're going to flog you, and That's how we're going to interrogate you, by beating you up. And at this point, Paul says, well, is it legal to do that to a Roman citizen? Because I'm a Roman citizen. And the tribune says, wait a second, hold on, wait, what? Actually, it's not the tribune, it's the centurion, who's a slightly lower officer who would have been in charge of actually doing this. And so Paul is sort of literally hanging off the rack, about to be flogged, and he says, I'm a Roman citizen. Centurion makes a report to the tribune. The tribune says, shoot, that was not great. And then he's a little bit surprised. So this guy Claudius Lysias is like, you're a Roman citizen. I had to buy my citizenship. And Paul says, well, actually, I was born a Roman citizen in Tarsus in Cilicia. And so Paul claims this identity, which means that he can't be flogged without a trial. And the Romans were really, really, really good. Their legal system is really the foundation, sort of the theoretical foundation for a lot of things that we take for granted in terms of due process and whatnot. So they were really, really concerned with their citizens' rights and being protected. And that was great if you were a Roman citizen, and not very many people were Roman citizens. So they had this incredible capacity to preserve their citizens' rights and oppress everybody else. And that's just sort of how it worked. So to be a Roman citizen was a really, really, really big deal. So the tribune is still like, well, I don't really know what to do here. So he calls the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, together and says, can you guys advise me on what's going on? Why are you mad at him? So there's a little bit more back and forth. And actually, Paul then has this opportunity to address the council and the Jewish council, and they were divided into Sadducees and Pharisees. And Paul gets kind of tricky because he says, basically what we're talking about here is the resurrection of the dead, and that's what I've been preaching, is the resurrection of the dead. And the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead, and the Sadducees didn't. So Paul basically does sort of a sneaky divide and conquer. And so then the Pharisees and the Sadducees get mad at each other, and none of this gets resolved. The way that they try to resolve it is that there's a faction now that actually is saying, you know what, we're going to go around the law and we're just going to kill Paul. We're just going to ambush him on the road. The tribune, Claudius Lysias, finds out about this, and he says, you know what, this is above my pay grade. I'm sending you to the governor over in Caesarea on the bank of the Mediterranean Sea. And so he sends Paul away from Jerusalem with 470 soldiers. So he's taking this pretty seriously. And part of this is the sort of the history of unrest and rioting. The tribune thought that Paul might have been a freedom fighter or a rebel who had something like 4,000 followers, and a riot that had taken place a few years earlier. But then he finds out that he wasn't. So anyway, all that to say, Paul has presented his defense. I've not done anything wrong. The tribune's like, that makes sense. These guys want to kill you though. So I'm going to pass the buck. This is above my pay grade. Go see Felix. So Felix is the name of the governor. And so Paul makes it to Felix, and safely. The tribune writes a letter. And in that letter, he says, most excellent Felix, you're awesome. And this man is coming to you, and he was a Roman citizen, and I knew that, and I rescued him from a mob, and they want to kill him, so figure it out, basically. And so he paints himself in a very positive light, because he says, I knew he was a Roman citizen, and I wanted to protect him, which of course he didn't find out until he was going to have him flogged. So anyway, so by now we're in we're flying through this. By now we're in chapter 24. Paul now is in custody with Felix. Felix was the governor of the whole province. And Paul apparently makes quite the impression with Felix. Actually, let me back up for just a second. So Paul goes to Felix. The high priest named what's his name? Ananias. Is it? Yeah, Ananias comes down from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and he brings a lawyer with him, and the lawyer presents the case that the Jewish people or the Sanhedrin and the high priest have against Paul. So they present that case. Paul gives a cheerful defense and says, I haven't done any of this of what they're saying. And then Felix Felix says, well, we'll wait until the tribune gets here, and I'm not gonna rule on this case. So we're just gonna press pause, basically. And that pause lasts for 2 years. And in that time, Paul apparently makes an impression on Felix. And so Felix and his wife, Drusilla, who was Jewish, had regular conversation with Paul. They would talk about a lot of different things, apparently. Felix apparently was also expecting a bribe from Paul. And what we know from Felix about other sources is that he wasn't a nice guy. He was pretty cruel. He was despotic. He was ambitious. He was also familiar in some way with Christianity, and so he just wasn't a great guy. And what basically ends up happening with Paul is that Felix also just sort of punts. So he's there. Paul's in custody for 2 years, and then Felix is reassigned. And rather than make any determination on Paul, he just passes it on to Festus, which is the name of the next governor. Festus seems to have a little bit more get up and go in him. So he sees the situation, calls together the council again, and we sort of have a repeat of like, what are they trying you for? That doesn't make any sense. I don't have anything. I don't know what I'm supposed to be charging you with. And then Paul ends up appealing to the emperor. So Festus gives him a choice. He says, I don't really know what I'm supposed to be charging you with. Why don't you go back to Jerusalem and we'll have the trial there so that the Sanhedrin can actually come up with something to charge you with. But at this point, there's a parallel plot that they want to, again, ambush and kill Paul on the way. Paul probably knows this at this point. And so he again employs his right as a Roman citizen to say, no, I don't want to have a change of venue. And actually, instead of that, I'm appealing directly to the emperor. Send me to Rome, and this is how this is going to be sorted out, which again was within his prerogative as a Roman citizen. And so Festus, right after that happens, Festus, the practice of how this would work when someone appealed to the emperor or appealed to the emperor's court. So then the governor, this was put in place so that people would have recourse if the governor overstepped his authority in some way, or some of the provincial government overstepped their authority. And so what they would have to do is send the person along with a letter of some kind, saying, this is what this person has been charged with, this is the evidence, this is my recommendation. And so again, Festus is like, I'm not really sure what to write here because this looks like an inter-religious issue. So he gets together with King Agrippa, who is Herod the Great's grandson, and Paul presents his defense before Agrippa as well. So Agrippa and Festus, the governor and the king, sort of are together, and Paul's in front of them, and then Festus basically says, again, I have no idea. How do we figure this out? Agrippa, you're a Jew. Can you help me figure this out? And Agrippa says, not really. I don't really, what are we supposed to charge him with? This is the prevailing question. What are we supposed to charge him with? And Paul, in his defense, proclaims again his witness. So he says, once again, he retells his conversion story on the road to Damascus. He talks about the resurrection of Jesus, and he talks about bringing good news to the Gentiles. Festus's response to this is great. This is chapter 26, verse 24. This was sort of our theme verse in seminary. Festus says, "You are out of your mind, Paul. Too much learning is making you insane." So we sort of appreciated that, and I don't know if that resonates with any of our MTSU folks. Too much learning is driving you insane. And Paul says, "I am not out of my mind, but I am speaking the sober truth," in his response. And so Festus and Agrippa are basically saying at the end of this, after they've heard Paul's witness, they say, we could have just set him free, because there's nothing here. He's done nothing to deserve death, nothing to deserve imprisonment, but he has appealed to the emperor. So we're gonna send him to the emperor in custody, in chains. It's not a cruise, but that's sort of how this ends, with Paul still in custody after several years, and this is through external dating. We know that this was the year 60 AD. And then he's off to Rome. And so that's a sort of a long summary, the narrative, tracing the narrative. But I think it's interesting how Paul engages, how he engages with these secular authorities, and what he does and what he doesn't do and how he does it, is really interesting, and I think could be helpful for us, at least in terms of starting conversation about how we engage politically. How do we engage with, resetting our sense of political engagement? So first, we notice that everything always, for Paul, all of these conversations are an opportunity for witness and evangelism. Every single time he retells, he is using his platform to preach the gospel. He tweaks it a little bit. He contextualizes it for sure, but he consistently retells his experience of conversion. He proclaims the resurrection of Jesus, and he talks about his mission to the Gentiles. And he doesn't compromise, even in the face of incredible incredible authority, incredible power. He's in front of the people who are making the decisions and literally making life and death decisions about him, about the governor Felix and Festus. They are the emperor's representatives in that part of the world. Their word goes, and in the midst of that, he tells this incredible story of this Jewish man who was crucified and resurrected. And that's extraordinary. So first, always, everything always, especially even in the political sphere, is an opportunity for witness, for evangelism. Second aspect maybe to highlight, though, is that the cost of preaching the gospel is chains, is imprisonment. And so if he had said, he could have gotten off, probably. He could have been released. And so I think perhaps there's two lessons for us here. One is the fairly obvious one, right? The gospel can get you in trouble. if we haven't sort of hammered that down yet, we can do that some more, but that's pretty straightforward. Preaching the gospel can get you into trouble. But one of the other sort of the flip side of this is that the gospel perhaps is the only legitimate basis for imprisonment or for breaking the law. So again, none of the other charges stick. None of the inciting a riot, none of this, sedition, treason, any and all of that. None of those charges stick. They don't hold water for Paul. He has not given the secular authorities any cause to arrest him, or to continue his imprisonment or custody. So it may be that preaching the gospel is the only legitimate cause for breaking the law, which calls us to live above reproach. And this is sort of a public question. Don't give people a call to not give people an excuse to discount the gospel. And that's really hard. But the way that we live is so important, and our public witness is so important. This gets into an interesting question, and we can chat about it. When is civil disobedience a gospel issue? Yeah, and I don't have a good answer for that. I think maybe that's a question we could chat about. When is it a gospel issue to break the law? So that's our third thing. The cost of the gospel is chains, and yet also the gospel mandate is probably the only reason, only a legitimate cause for transgressing law. So the third thing that Paul does that is I think instructive for us is leveraging your citizenship for the gospel. So Paul utilizes his Roman citizenship as a measure of last resort. He does that after he tries to make the case, after he tries to reason, after all his other after lots of other things are exhausted, right? When he's about to be flogged, that's when he says, by the way, I'm a Roman citizen. So again, there's sort of a couple different ways that this can go, perhaps. So he had a strong and full awareness of how the Roman judicial process works. He would have been engaged in some way. So he was aware of the benefits that were afforded to him, aware of the privileges that afforded him, and he used that for the proclamation of the gospel. But he also didn't use it in certain ways. And so remember the jailer in Philippi who did flog him, did throw him in jail without a trial. So Paul would have been within his rights to press charges, to get that guy in major trouble. But he didn't. And so both him and the tribune here, and the centurion, probably, Paul could have gotten retribution and punishment, because he would have been within his rights to do that, but he doesn't. So he doesn't wield his rights offensively, if that makes sense. He doesn't wield it as a weapon, but he wields them tactfully as a way to advance the gospel. In other words, his citizenship opens opportunities for him, but he's aware, but he doesn't weaponize it. And then finally, sort of the last thing, thinking a big picture. So what is going on here in these 5 chapters when we sort of step back and look at what's going on? So what's going on is that there is a religious dispute between Paul and between the Jewish authorities, this council, and this religious dispute gets taken before secular authorities. And Felix and Festus and Agrippa and Claudius and Lysias, they're all like, we can't make a determination in this case. And they all sort of pass the buck, and eventually Paul gets sent off to Rome. But unfortunately, this becomes part of Christian history, that religious disputes get adjudicated by secular authorities. And of course, the watershed moment of this is actually when Constantine is converted, and then he calls together the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, several centuries after this, and he's calling together this this group of bishops and leaders and whatnot to talk about this theological issue of who is Jesus, and is Jesus like God or is Jesus God? But this is getting decided with all the might of the empire behind it, all the might of Constantine's political and military strength is weighing into this theological question. And of course, this happens again and again and again in Christian history. So the question for Acts here, of course, is, does anybody really win when this happens? Does the high priest win? Does the council win? Well, kind of, not really. They get rid of Paul. It takes a couple years, but they don't get a definitive ruling, and they don't get to carry out justice, their perspective of justice. It just kind of trickles along for a couple years, but they don't win necessarily. And does Paul win? Paul doesn't really win either, because he's imprisoned for years, and he ends up getting to Rome and in chains. And so while we know that, and actually Jesus shows up in a vision and says, "You are going to Rome, and I am with you." I think that speaks more to the power of God to redeem everything, rather than saying that nothing is out of God's reach. So this is how Paul gets to Rome, and that's that. But does Paul win? I'm not sure Paul wins here either. So again, that's more an observation rather than anything else. But when religious disputes, when conflict between interreligious conflict gets adjudicated by secular authorities, it's hard to say that there's a winner in any way, or that reconciliation is possible once we take that step. So finally, just to say, and then I am interested in some of your thoughts for sure. Paul is this wonderful example. He is captive only to the claim of the gospel and the force of the Holy Spirit. So he's in chains. He uses his Roman citizenship, but there's no question about where his allegiance ultimately and truly and fully lies. And that's what this incredible mandate that he's been given to, having experienced Jesus, he needs to tell the world about Jesus. Everything else is subordinated to that.